town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her, and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. The word of the Lord.
That passage from Luke chapter 7 comes pretty quickly after Jesus heals the servant of the centurion, the Roman centurion. You might remember that story. And then we come to verse 11, and Jesus brings back to life the son of the widow. So that's where we are in the Gospel of Luke this morning. Do you have anyone that you know you would be besties with if you could just meet them? Maybe in a parallel universe or in another life. Am I the only one that sort of knows like celebrities and historical figures, and I think to myself, I know that we would be best friends. If they could just meet me, right? One of those people for me is Henry Nouwen, Dutch priest, and a guy that writes a lot about spirituality and teaching social justice. And Henry Nouwen describes Jesus' life and ministry in the Gospels as a path of downward mobility. The whole thing, the whole story of divine redemption, is not one of Jesus pulling people to the upper echelons of society. It's an account of Jesus' love for all human beings, most of whom were poor, disenfranchised. And Jesus' response to his deep love for humanity is not to exalt the rich, but to become poor. The Christ hymn in Philippians is a beautiful poem about this. The Son did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped, to be held onto, but instead he let go of his place in the Godhead for the sole purpose of being able to commune not with kings, but with the jesters of the court, the outcasts, the sinners, and the sick. Nouwen says that Jesus chooses pain, rejection, persecution, and even death rather than the path of upward mobility toward power, authority, influence, and wealth. This is a different system than the one that we have today, even among those who mean well to help others. Today, having compassion often means helping the less fortunate. It means short-term mission trips to poor areas, adopting faraway villages, things like that. Real compassion, or the compassion embodied by Jesus, runs counter to our culture's constant call to succeed, to impress, and to be powerful. Jesus' compassion is a call to suffer with the powerless. To quote Nouwen one more time, compassion means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute and building a home there. God's compassion is total, absolute, unconditional, and without reservation. And yet, the main verb in our passage for today seems like the opposite. Jesus raises someone from the dead. He doesn't get down into the grave with him. Yet. Is there something different about raising someone from the dead? What is the relationship between Jesus' compassion and his miracles of healing? In our story, Jesus saw the mother weeping, and his heart went out to her. He felt pity. He had compassion. Right in his gut, it says. He touches the coffin. He tells the boy to arise and gives him back to his mother. Jesus knew that this woman's life was effectively over. A childless widow would have had virtually no hope of upward mobility, if she even survived very long after the death of her only child. Jesus' compassion was overwhelming, not for the son, not for the pallbearers, not for the large crowd, not for his disciples, not even for himself, but for the boy's mother. Compassion for her brought back to life for her son. In fact, none of the people who were raised from the dead in the Gospels were raised because of their piety, because they were worthy, or because they earned some kind of second chance at life. This is a difficult system to unpack. Now, pastors and preachers support each other throughout the year, often in small ways. For example, when tragedy strikes, preachers will find ways to acknowledge amongst each other how difficult it might be to preach that following Sunday. A short text of encouragement, posts and comments on preaching message boards and Facebook pages. Even if it's not some kind of event that has preceded that Sunday, there are passages in the lectionary that are just difficult on their own. So the conversation goes like this sometimes. What are you preaching on this week? 2 Kings, when a group of teens is devoured by a bear. Oh, I guess you have some decisions to make. Now, as a clergy person who labors outside the bounds of the church, as our polity says, I don't have these conversations often as those who preach regularly. But as I was preparing for worship today, I was reading one Lutheran pastor's take on Luke 7. Not just our passage for today about the widow and her son, but also the centurion's slave. The centurion's slave was healed on account of the official's great faith, it says. The pastor wrote several paragraphs reflecting on the miracles. He compares the circumstances of the healings. He studies some of the Greek terminology. He contrasts the characters and discusses various themes. There's even a chart that demonstrates the differences in the accounts. Very helpful. For example, the New International Version of the Bible says that Jewish leaders pleaded with Jesus to do this thing for the centurion because he deserves it. He loves his country, they say, and he built our synagogue. As Jesus approached the house, he announced that nowhere in all of Israel had he found anyone with faith as great as that of the centurion. The New International Version is so committed to the piety of the centurion that the subject heading is the faith of the centurion, not that his slave was raised from the dead. Back to the Lutheran pastor. He says it would be wrong to think that all you need is just a little more faith in order for miracles to happen to you. It would be wrong to think that, he said. And I understand why he says that. First of all, it just kind of seems like bad theology to believe that we just have to keep striving for more and more faith in order for Jesus to take notice of our needs. What are the levels? Can I ask for a small miracle and have just a little bit of faith? And second, as our Lutheran friend points out, it isn't the centurion's slave who had the faith, even though it is the slave who benefits from the miracle. It's the centurion's faith that Jesus proclaims. By the way, the slave does benefit from being raised from the dead, right? The slave was healed and now gets to return to a life of servitude. Looking at our passage, or the pastor's chart, reveals the obvious. No faith is mentioned in our account at all, and yet the miracle is arguably even greater, since the child in question was actually dead and not just close to death. A greater miracle for no faith at all. What is going on? Also, I feel like I've referred to him enough times that I should tell you the name of the pastor that I'm referencing. His name is Mark Hoffman. He is a pastor and biblical scholar at Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. See, biblical authors, if you talk about someone, it's polite to name them. Now, anyway, back to the chart. Pastor Mark says that we would be wrong to obsess over our faith when it comes to miracles. The widow had no faith. The people around her had no faith that we read about. They were living out their Jewish customs by carrying the dead outside the city gates within 24 hours. The only thing Jesus says to the woman is, "Don't cry." Greatest faith in all the land? Your slave is healed. No faith at all, but weeping bitterly on your way to the city gate to bury your only child not long after you buried your husband, your son is revived. So therefore, I agree with Dr. Hoffman. And as the preacher for today, I wag my finger at all of us when I say, do not get hung up on your faith level when asking for miracles. Again, best faith in all the land, no faith at all. Same result. Pastor Hoffman didn't really say anything revolutionary in his reflections, and he didn't say anything wrong as I was reading through them, or super right for that matter. He just kind of outlines the two passages, the centurion and the widow. He discusses their differences and similarities, and because I am a simple man, I really enjoyed his remarks. Even if I wasn't deeply challenged or moved, it is risky to innovate in the field of biblical studies. Then I got to his last paragraph, the end of his study. And as I read his conclusion, I thought to myself, wow, Reverend, you had some decisions to make. I imagined then that he received many, many supportive messages from fellow preachers and scholars, as did everybody who was preaching on December 16th, 2012. This is how Mark concluded his study. I am writing these reflections on the text on December 14th, 2012, the day of the horrific killings at the elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut. I am painfully aware, this is him still speaking, I am painfully aware that saying "do not weep" may sound woefully inadequate in all those times of sickness, loss, and death. What gives these words their authority, however, is that they are spoken by Jesus. He is the compassionate presence of God in our lives. He is the one who does actually heal the sick and raise the dead. He is the one who himself is killed for our sake, but is raised from death to assure us that God's love does indeed endure. That is the hope in which we live and die. That was the moment that I learned something new. So thank you, Mark, not only for being willing to publish your notes when you did, but for sticking your scholarly and pastoral neck out there in a meek, humble attempt to make sense of the relationship between Jesus' miracles and the absolute terror and tragedy that occurred on that same day. And thank you, Mark, for making this part-time pulpit supply preacher realize that as hard as it is to preach on some Sundays during weeks and seasons of violence, injustice, tragedies, and disasters, it can be heart-wrenching to sit in the pews and listen to someone talk about someone's faith earning them a miracle. And not just anyone earning a miracle, a slave owner, a Roman soldier, a man with unimaginable power whom we never even see in the story. Jesus proclaims how great his faith is. And I'm telling you right now that if I found myself drowning in the grief of losing a child, and some preacher points to the faith of the centurion, I might lose it. Give me the widow. Don't tell me not to cry, but give me the widow, the poorest of the poor. It's not out of the question that when they buried her son outside the city, they just closed the gate on their way back in, leaving her more alone than she had ever been in her short, miserable life. Do you think she had any faith? I honestly don't know, and that is why I love her. Maybe her faith was in her fulfilling her Jewish customs of the day, carrying her baby outside of the city to be buried. Maybe her faith was found in her tears as she wept. Maybe she had no faith. Maybe she was like many women who have sat in a pew and listened to a preacher preach on a tough text about women being silent, trying to make sense of it while being abused. Or maybe the widow was like a father who has attended church while his husband is dying in the hospital and he can't be there for him because the state he lives in doesn't have any faith in his marriage. So he sits and listens to reflections on passages about love, mercy, and kindness. Difficult to preach, nearly impossible to hear. So give me the widow. In the end, the stories of Jesus raising anyone from the dead or healing them from sickness are as difficult as they are incredible. Difficult to preach about, maybe especially for people like chaplains who immerse themselves in the grief of others. Difficult to listen to, maybe especially for people who have lost loved ones, despite desperately trying to have faith in Jesus' healing touch. I'm not going to say that these miracles cannot happen to us. I don't think I'm allowed to say that. That they're not going to happen to me or to you or to anyone. I don't think I'm encouraged to say that these stories of Jesus healing the sick and raising the dead are not about those things actually happening in real life. I'm not saying that. Instead, I'll just say that in these stories, like in real life, I am drawn to the people. Does the Roman centurion deserve to have his slave healed? No. Does Jairus, the synagogue leader, deserve to have his daughter raised from the dead? No. Does the widow in our passage deserve to have her son brought back to life? Still probably no. And yet all of these people moved Jesus to compassion, moved him to act. He felt it in his gut. He was drawn to them, all of them. The fact that Jesus was so moved by their grief that he responded with his whole heart and body, to me, that is a miracle. Jesus' compassion is a miracle. The word really does mean he felt it in his organs. He felt something so deeply human that he was compelled to respond. In those moments, the Son did not consider equality with God as something to be held onto, clasped and clutched and hoarded. He let go of it and became a human being to the point of feeling compassion in his human body. Let us be drawn to each other more than the miracles themselves. Let us be drawn to the human beings and the stories, the crowd as they carried the boy to the city gate, the slave who was brought back to life only to live out the rest of it in bondage, the person next to us who has lost everything. And let our compassion move us. Let us be moved to respond to the immigrants in our town who are afraid to leave their homes. We can participate in the miraculous, not by pulling people up to our station, but by moving next to them, making a home, and being found by them. The miracle of Jesus, to me, the real demonstration of his power that you and I can actually participate in, that real miracle is best summed up in the third account of Jesus raising somebody from the dead. In John's Gospel, chapter 11, it says, after hearing that Lazarus died, and upon seeing his sisters and the community weeping, it says that Jesus was deeply troubled. So I suggest the climax of that story is not in verse 43 when Jesus says, Lazarus, come out. For me, the climax is verse 35. Jesus wept. Jesus, I know that my loved ones are not coming back from the grave. Will you weep with me? Amen.